The first thing David noticed wasn't the flashing blue and red lights painting the tall pines in strokes of panic. It wasn't the grim set of Sheriff Brody's jaw or the almost gleeful smirk playing on the lips of Carol Jean Perkins, the self-appointed queen of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association. It was the sign, a crisp, professionally printed "For Sale" sign, hammered into the soft earth right next to his grandfather's hand-carved mailbox. His mailbox, his land. The Realtor, a woman who looked far too young and chipper for this kind of ugly business, stood beside it, clutching a portfolio like a shield. Carol Jean, her silver hair a perfect, unmoving helmet, pointed a manicured finger at David, who stood calmly on his side of the heavy steel gate he'd installed just that morning. "There he is, Sheriff. That's the man who is illegally barricading HOA property and threatening our invited guest." Sheriff Brody sighed. The sound, a low rumble of worn-out patience. The scent of pine needles and hot dust filled the air, thick and heavy. "Son," he started, his voice gravelly, "you can't just block the access road. This is a problem." David took a slow sip of coffee from his thermos, the steam ghosting into the cool mountain morning. He met the sheriff's gaze, then let his eyes drift to Carol Jean's triumphant face. He'd been waiting for this. He'd planned for it. "With all due respect, Sheriff," David said, his voice even and calm, a stark contrast to the pulsing lights bathing the scene. "They're the ones trespassing." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant caw of a raven. The Realtor's smile faltered. Carol Jean's smirk froze. This wasn't just a fight. It was a carefully laid trap, and they had just walked right into it. "Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far this kind of HOA power illegally reaches." It all began 6 months earlier with the smell of old paper and cedar. David had inherited his grandfather's cabin in the Missouri Ozarks, a place built by hand with timber felled from the very same land. It wasn't a house, it was a history book. He ran his hand over the rough-hewn mantelpiece, feeling the divots and grooves his grandfather's tools had left behind. The air inside was a mix of wood smoke from 100 winter fires, the faint, sweet scent of his grandmother's long-gone rose potpourri, and the sharp tang of mothballs from the chest in the corner. For David, a combat engineer recently separated from the Army, the quiet was a balm. The predictable rhythm of chopping wood, fixing the leaky downspout, and watching deer graze at dusk was the best kind of therapy. The cabin sat at the very end of a winding gravel road, the last of 4 properties tucked deep into the woods. He believed he'd found sanctuary. He was wrong. He'd found a war zone, and its commander was about to make her presence known. Her name was Carol Jean Perkins. She appeared on his porch 3 days after he moved in, holding a welcome basket filled with suspiciously perfect muffins and a thick, professionally bound book titled Whispering Pines, Covenants, and Bylaws. She was in her late 50s, dressed in expensive LL Bean gear that looked like it had never seen a speck of actual dirt. Her smile was wide and bright, but it never quite reached her eyes. Those eyes were scanners, cataloging every detail of his property, the slightly peeling paint on the window trim, the stack of firewood he'd begun, the old wind chimes his grandmother had loved. The air around her smelled of lavender and something else, something sharp and chemical, like industrial-strength hairspray. "Welcome to the neighborhood, David," she chirped, her voice a little too loud for the quiet woods. "We're so glad to have some new blood. We on the HOA board pride ourselves on maintaining the natural beauty and property values of our community." David, taught to be respectful by a grandfather who valued manners, took the basket. "Thank you, ma'am. That's mighty kind of you." "Oh, call me Carol Jean," she said, her eyes flicking to the wind chimes which were tinkling softly in the breeze. A tiny frown creased the skin between her perfectly plucked eyebrows. "You'll want to give that book a good read. We find that when everyone is on the same page, things run so much more smoothly. It was a warning disguised as a welcome. A velvet glove hiding an iron fist. David had spent a decade in the military dealing with pointless regulations and power tripping. Senior NCOs. He recognized the type instantly, the kind of person who wields tiny amounts of power like a weapon of mass destruction. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love this ending. Stick with me. The first volley in her war came a week later. A crisp white envelope in his mailbox. Inside, a letter printed on heavy cardstock bearing the whispering. Pines HOA logo. Violation notice. Tapoizudi 25, A113. Unapproved exterior adornment. It was the wind chimes. Apparently, according to Section 4, Paragraph C, subsection die, any audible or kinetic lawn ornament had to be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee, of which Carol Jean was the chair, sole member, and final arbiter. The fine was $50. David stood on his porch, the letter in his hand, and looked at the chimes. They were made of bits of sea glass and driftwood his grandmother had collected on a trip to the coast decades ago. Their sound was less a chime and more a gentle, woody clatter, barely audible over the rustle of the oak leaves. The absurdity of it was breathtaking. It was a test, a probe of his defenses to see if he would comply. He thought about fighting it, about writing a letter quoting decibel levels and artistic expression. But he was tired. He wanted peace. He took the chimes down, paid the fine online, and felt a small piece of his grandfather's legacy chip away. He had just given her a tactical victory, and he knew with the cold certainty of a soldier sensing an ambush that it was a mistake. The next front opened over the woodpile. His grandfather had built a sturdy three-sided woodshed at the edge of the property line. For 50 years, it had been stacked high with split oak and hickory, a comforting sight against the coming winter. David spent 2 weeks felling a dead oak, splitting it with a satisfying rhythm, and stacking it neatly in the shed, just as his grandfather had taught him. The scent of fresh-cut oak, earthy and sharp, was the smell of self-sufficiency. 2 days after he finished, the email arrived. Violation notice, 2025, A147, improper storage of raw building materials and visual nuisance. This time, the email, penned by Carol Jean, was longer. It explained that while firewood was permissible, the visibility of the woodpile from the main road, a road barely traveled by anyone but the 4 families at the end of the lane, was not in keeping with the pristine, uncluttered aesthetic of Whispering Pines. He was instructed to erect a 6-foot privacy fence to obscure the view, or face a daily fine of $25. This time, something in him hardened. This wasn't about a $50 fine for some noisy glass. This was about the fundamental way of life in the Ozarks. It was an attack on the very concept of a man providing for his own heat in the winter. He imagined his grandfather's reaction, a low chuckle, a shake of his head, and a quiet refusal to bend to such foolishness. This isn't just my fight. It's yours, too. Tell me if your HOA has ever crossed the line. That night, David didn't sleep. He poured a cup of coffee, the dark liquid a stark contrast to the white pages of the HOA covenant book, and started reading. He read every single line, every arcane definition, every convoluted restriction. His engineer's brain, trained to find structural weaknesses, kicked into high gear. He wasn't just reading, he was conducting reconnaissance. He highlighted, made notes, and cross-referenced sections. The language was intentionally dense, designed to intimidate and confuse. But David wasn't intimidated. He was mapping the battlefield. And then he found it. Tucked away in the appendices, in a section detailing the history of the development, was the original plat map from 1978. It clearly showed the main road, Whispering Pines Lane, and then a smaller, unmarked gravel path that split off to service the final 4 lots. A footnote in tiny, faded type referenced a separate document, Easement and right-of-way agreement, document 78-349B, Hill County Records Office. The HOA covenant was signed in 1995. The easement agreement was dated 17 years earlier. The OW? Next morning, the air was crisp, carrying the smell of rain from the night before. Instead of heading to the hardware store for fence posts, David drove his truck 40 minutes into the county seat. The records office was a dusty, quiet place that smelled of aging paper and floor wax. It took the clerk 20 minutes to find the microfiche. But when she did, David felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind he used to get right before a mission. There it was, in black and white. A legally binding easement granted by his grandfather, Jedediah Mills, to the other three original property owners. The agreement gave them permanent, irrevocable access to their properties via the gravel road that crossed a corner of his land. It also stipulated that the four property owners were jointly responsible for the maintenance of that specific stretch of road. The document predated the HOA by nearly 2 decades, and nowhere in its ironclad legal language was the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association mentioned. They had no legal authority, no jurisdiction over that final 500 yards of gravel. They had been acting like they owned it, sending threatening letters and levying fines based on its appearance, but legally, it was none of their business. This was the first knowledge bomb, a crack in Carol Jean's fortress. He now knew the road to his cabin was, for all legal intents and purposes, his to control. He drove home feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. He now had a weapon. He decided to hold it in reserve, to see what Carol Jean would do next. He didn't have to wait long. His quiet non-compliance with the woodpile edict seemed to enrage her. She couldn't fine him if she couldn't prove he'd received the notice, so she began a campaign of psychological warfare. He'd see her silver SUV parked at the turnoff, just sitting there, watching his house. He'd get anonymous notes in his mailbox, just a single sentence typed on a slip of paper. Some people don't belong here. He'd come out in the morning to find small, deliberately placed piles of trash, a soda can, a fast food bag, just inside his property line, a clear message. What would you have done in my place? Drop it in the comments. The other neighbors, decent people who were either too afraid or too weary to fight her, grew distant. A wave became a hesitant nod. An offer of help with a fallen tree was politely declined. She was isolating him, marking him as a target, turning the sanctuary into a prison. The stress began to wear on him. The quiet of the woods no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. The snap of a twig made him jump. He was sleeping with one eye open again, a habit he thought he'd left behind in the desert. The breaking point, the moment defiance crystallized into a full-blown counteroffensive, came via certified mail. The letter was thick. Inside was a formal declaration from the HOA board. It listed his uncured violations. The woodpile, a mailbox they now claimed was a non-conforming color, and a new fabricated charge of commercial vehicle storage. Because his personal pickup truck had a small, faded logo of a friend's construction company on the door. Due to his pattern of willful disregard for the community covenants, the board had voted to place a lien on his property. Furthermore, it stated they were actively exploring all legal avenues to recover administrative costs and restore community harmony, up to and including foreclosure and forced sale as permitted by state law. It was a declaration of total war. An illegal one, he suspected, but one designed to crush him under the weight of legal fees and bureaucratic intimidation. They were trying to steal his home, his grandfather's home. 2 days later, the phone rang. A cheerful, impossibly upbeat voice on the other end. "Hi, is this David Mills? This is Brenda from Mountain View Realty. I'm calling because Carol Jean Perkins from the Whispering Pines HOA gave me your number and said you were getting ready to list your lovely cabin. She said you were motivated to sell and that I should come by this Friday at 10 a.m. to take some photos and get the listing started. Isn't that exciting? The audacity of it was a physical blow. It sucked the air from his lungs. They hadn't just threatened him. They had already acted, hiring a realtor to sell his property out from under him. They were so arrogant, so certain of their power, that they didn't even imagine he would fight back. The rage that filled him was cold and perfectly clear. He saw the entire operation laid out in his mind. He let out a slow breath. "Brenda," he said, his voice a mask of polite interest. "Yes, I've been talking with Carol Jean about it. This Friday at 10, you said? That sounds just fine. The gate will be open for you." He hung up the phone. The house was silent. He looked at the portrait of his grandfather on the wall, a stern man with kind eyes. In that moment, David knew exactly what he had to do. The soldier in him took over. He was no longer just defending, he was setting a perimeter. He was preparing a kill zone. The night before the showing, a fog rolled in, thick and damp, clinging to the trees. It muffled all sound, creating a world of ghosts and shadows. David worked under the cold, white glare of his truck's headlights. The air tasted of wet earth and iron. He used a post-hole digger, his movements efficient and powerful, sinking 2 8-foot steel posts 3 feet deep into the ground on either side of the gravel road, right at the point where his private easement began. He filled the holes with quick-setting concrete, the gritty sound of the mix scraping against the metal bucket. As the concrete began to cure, he pulled a heavy-gauge logging chain from the bed of his truck. The links were as thick as his thumb, cold and heavy in his hands. The sound of the chain dragging on the gravel was a harsh, metallic whisper in the foggy night. He looped it around one post, pulled it taut across the road, and secured it to the other with a massive, case-hardened padlock that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. The final touch was the sign. He'd had it made at a print shop in town. He attached it to the center of the chain with zip ties. It was white with stark, black, no-nonsense lettering. Private easement. Access restricted per Hill County dock. Our 78349B. No HOA jurisdiction, all unauthorized. Personnel, including Whispering Pines Hoe Board, will be prosecuted for trespassing D. Mills, property owner. He stepped back, his breath pluming in the cold air. The fog swirled around the gate, the sign appearing and disappearing like a phantom. Warning. It was a line drawn in the sand, not with a stick, but with concrete and steel. The next morning, he was on his porch before sunrise, sipping coffee, watching the fog burn off in the rising sun. The smell of victory was pine-scented and clean. He heard the car before he saw it, the crunch of tires on gravel, the sound of an engine that cost more than his truck, a silver SUV. It stopped abruptly. A door slammed shut with a sound that echoed through the peaceful woods. Then came the voice, high and tight with indignation, slicing through the morning calm. "What in God's name is this?" David leaned back in his rocking chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. He took another sip of coffee. Phase 1 was complete. The enemy had made contact with his defensive perimeter. And the battle for Whispering Pines had just begun. The sound of Carol Jean's voice, sharp as broken glass, echoed off the pines. David left his coffee on the porch railing and walked down the gravel path toward the gate, his boots crunching with a deliberate, unhurried rhythm. The air was thick with tension, a mixture of pine scent, diesel fumes from the sheriff's idling cruiser, and Carol Jean's expensive, cloying perfume. He arrived at the gate and stood, hands in his pockets, a picture of calm she clearly found. Infuriating. "Take this ridiculous thing down immediately, David," she commanded, not asked. Her face was flushed, a blotchy red creeping up her neck. The young realtor looked like she wanted the earth to swallow her whole. David ignored her, his eyes on Sheriff Brody. "Morning, Sheriff." He pulled a folded, plastic-sleeved document from his back pocket. "I believe this will clear things up." He passed the copy of the 1978 easement agreement through the bars of the gate. Brody took it, his expression weary. He read through. It slowly, his lips moving slightly. He read it again. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the crackle of the police radio. Finally, he looked up. Not at David, but at Carol Jean. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, handing the document back to David. "According to this section of road is a private easement. It predates your HOA. As far as I can tell, it's not your property to control." Carol Jean's jaw dropped. That's preposterous. We maintain it. We are the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." "That may be," Brody said, his patience finally snapping. "But this is a legal document recorded with the county. Your disagreement is a civil matter. I'm not here to adjudicate property, law. But I can't make him take down a gate on what appears to be his own land, controlling access to a private easement. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual police work to do." He gave David a curt nod, got back in his cruiser, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and a stunned silence in his wake. The realtor stammered an apology and practically sprinted back to her car. It was just David and Carol Jean, separated by a length of logging chain. The mask of civility was gone. Her eyes, cold and hard as river stones, locked onto his. "You think you're clever, don't you, Mr. Mills?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life. This is my community. You will regret this." She spun on her heel and marched back to her SUV, slamming the door so hard a bird startled from a nearby branch. David knew this wasn't the end. It was the start of a new, uglier phase of the war. He had won the first skirmish, but in doing so, he had enraged the enemy commander and forced her to escalate. The retaliation was swift and relentless. On Monday, an email arrived with a fine for $500 for an unauthorized permanent structure, referring to the gate posts. On Tuesday, a courier delivered a thick envelope containing a 20-page cease and desist letter from a high-priced law firm in the city. It was filled with convoluted legal threats, citing non-existent state statutes and intentionally misinterpreting the HOA bylaws. The paper it was printed on felt heavy and expensive, and as he opened it, a faint whiff of lavender hairspray hit him. The message was clear. She had money, and she would use it to bury him. On Wednesday morning, things turned criminal. He woke, up to silence. The familiar, gentle hum of the well pump kicking on was absent. When he turned the tap in the kitchen, nothing came out but a sad gurgle and a hiss of air. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He walked out to the well house, the damp earth cold under his boots. The ground around it was soaked, a dark, muddy patch spreading out into the grass. He followed the water line that ran toward the cabin and found it halfway. It wasn't a leak. It wasn't a burst pipe from a pressure failure. It was a cut, a clean, precise slice through the thick PVC pipe, made by a saw. The smell of the muddy earth was primal, a scent of disruption and violation. This was a direct attack on his lifeblood, his water supply. His combat engineer training kicked into a gear he hadn't used in years. An enemy had breached his perimeter and sabotaged a critical supply line. This was no longer a war of letters and fines. It was an active insurgency. Ever dealt with an HOA bully? Let's see how many of us there are. He spent the day making repairs, his hands covered in mud and PVC cement. As he worked, he planned. Phase 2 would be about fortification and intelligence gathering. That afternoon, he drove into town and bought 4 motion-activated trail cameras, the kind hunters use. He spent the evening placing them in the trees, overlooking his water line, the access road, and the gate, their camouflaged casings blending perfectly with the bark. He was establishing an early warning system. He was now gathering evidence. His next move was to secure allies. He knew he couldn't fight this alone. He thought of the other 3 homes on the easement. 2 were weekend cabins, mostly empty. But the third belonged to Earl Abernathy, an 80-year-old widower who had lived there since before the HOA existed. David walked over that evening, the easement document in hand. Earl's house smelled of old books, pipe tobacco, and frying bacon. He was a small, wiry man with kind, watery eyes and a firm handshake. He listened intently as David explained the situation with the gate and the easement. When David finished, Earl let out a long, slow sigh. "Always knew that road was ours," he said, his voice a quiet rasp. "But after Martha passed, I just didn't have the fight in me anymore. Carol Jean, she can wear a man down." Earl told his own stories. How Carol Jean had led a campaign to have his vegetable garden, which he depended on for food, declared a blight until he agreed to hide it behind a lattice fence. How she'd fined him $200 for having his grandson's car parked in his driveway for a week while the boy visited from college. His voice cracked when he told David about the flagpole. "Had a flag up for 40 years, he said, looking at a framed photo of a young woman on his mantel. "Flew it every day. After Martha died of cancer, it was a comfort, a routine. Carol Jean said the pole wasn't on the approved list. Said the sound of the rope clanking against it in the wind was a nuisance. Fought me on it for months. It was easier to just take it down." Hearing this, David's anger became something colder, harder. Carol Jean wasn't protecting property values. She was feeding a hunger for control by preying on the vulnerable. She was a bully who broke people's spirits over birdhouses and flagpoles. "Earl," David said, leaning forward, "did you know she's required by state law to hold open board meetings? To let any member review the HOA's finances?" Earl snorted. "Meetings? She sends out a newsletter twice a year telling us what she's decided. Once, about 5 years back, a few of us asked to see the budget. She sent her lawyer after us, threatening to sue us for harassment. We all backed down." A light went on in David's head. That night, he wasn't poring over the HOA bylaws. He was researching the Missouri Nonprofit Corporation Act, the state law that governs all HOAs, and there it was, a second, more powerful, knowledge bomb. The law was explicit. All members had a right to attend board meetings, which must be announced with proper notice. All members had a right to inspect all financial records, contracts, and minutes. Any vote to spend money on non-budgeted items, like a high-priced lawyer for a personal vendetta, required a vote of the membership. Carol Jean wasn't just a bully. She was operating illegally, using the HOA as her own personal slush fund and fiefdom. The next morning, David drafted a letter. It was formal, citing the specific state statutes he'd found. He requested a complete accounting of all financials, from the past 5 years, copies of all board meeting minutes, and the current roster of board members. He sent it via certified mail not just to the HOA's official address, but to the home addresses of the 2 other board members Earl had identified, a meek accountant and a retired dentist who reportedly did whatever Carol Jean said. He was flanking her, cutting her off from her lieutenants. He expected panic, a frantic call, maybe even a grudging offer of a truce. What he got was a flank attack of his own. "If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type, 'Yes, so we can get this trending.'" A week later, a pristine white truck from the Hill County Health Department pulled up to his gate. A man with a clipboard and a sour expression introduced himself as a county inspector. He said an anonymous complaint had been filed about a possible septic system failure on David's property. David knew immediately who had made the call. Carol Jean wasn't just the HOA president. She was married to Bill Perkins, a county commissioner. The inspector spent 3 hours on the property. He had a camera on a long snake he fed into the septic tank. He took soil samples. He made notes. The whole time, he had an air of someone who had decided on the outcome before he even arrived. The next day, David received the official report. It was a death sentence. The inspector claimed his drain field was saturated, his tank was cracked, and that the entire system was an imminent environmental hazard. He was ordered to replace the entire system within 30 days, at an estimated Cost of $20,000, or the county would condemn the property. It was a brilliant, vicious move. A checkmate. David had the money from his Army savings, but a $20,000 hit would cripple him, leaving him with nothing left to fight her legally. He was outmaneuvered. He sat on his porch, the condemnation notice in his hand, and felt the first real flicker of despair. The air, usually so clean and fresh, felt heavy, tasting of defeat. He was on the phone with the health department, arguing with a supervisor, when Carol Jean herself called. He let it go to voicemail. Her message was dripping with false sympathy. "David, this is Carol Jean. I heard about the unfortunate news regarding your septic system. It's just terrible. You know, people like you come in here and think you can just ignore the rules that keep this place from turning into a trailer park like the one I grew up in. It's a shame, really. If you'd just been more cooperative, perhaps things wouldn't have gotten so complicated." And there it was. In her moment of triumph, she had revealed her vulnerability, her entire motivation. This wasn't about community standards. This was about a deep, gnawing insecurity, a desperate, pathological fear of her own past. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was trying to build a wall around her own history, and David was a threat to that wall. The knowledge didn't make him pity her. It made him see her as even more dangerous. A cornered animal is predictable. A person fighting their own ghost is not. What they did next almost made me lose everything, but it also gave me the win of my life. That evening, feeling the walls closing in, David walked over to Earl's. He laid out the whole situation, the septic condemnation, the $20,000 estimate, the clear abuse of the county commissioner's power. Earl listened, his old face grim. He slowly packed his pipe, the sweet, earthy scent of cherry tobacco filling the small living room. "She thinks she has us," Earl said quietly. "Thinks an old man and a young soldier don't have any fight. She's wrong." He picked up his old rotary phone and dialed a number from a faded address book. "Katie, honey, it's your Uncle Earl. I'm fine. Listen, I have a story for you. A real humdinger." He explained everything to his niece. David could only hear his side of the conversation, but it was enough. Earl's niece was an investigative reporter for a television station in Springfield, a reporter with a reputation for taking on corrupt local officials. The next afternoon, just as the sun began to dip below the ridge, casting long shadows across the valley, a white news van with a large satellite dish on top rumbled down the lane. It pulled to a stop just outside the gate. A young, energetic woman with a microphone in her hand and a cameraman in tow stepped out. She looked at David's hand-painted sign, at the heavy chain, and then up at the cabin, nestled peacefully in the trees. A determined smile spread across her face. The cameraman hoisted his camera onto his shoulder. A small red light blinked on, a beacon in the fading light. The fight for the cabin on Whispering Pines Lane was no longer a private war. It was about to become the lead story on the 6 o'clock news. The 6 o'clock news segment was a masterpiece of controlled demolition. Katie, the reporter, framed the story with the precision of a surgeon. It opened with a sweeping aerial shot of David's cabin, a picture of rustic tranquility, before cutting to a tight shot of the severed water line, the clean, deliberate cut glistening in the camera's light. The headline flashed across the screen, "Bullies on the board, veteran targeted by HOA and county official after inheriting family home." The story laid out the facts like a prosecutor's opening statement. There was David, calm and articulate, explaining the easement document. There was a tearful Earl Abernathy, his voice trembling as he recounted the story of his flagpole, a story that resonated far more deeply with the local Ozarkian viewers than any bylaw ever could. Then came the bombshell. Katie's investigation had uncovered a pattern of complaints against the Hill County Health Department, specifically concerning surprise inspections ordered on properties owned by individuals, known to be in disputes with County Commissioner Bill Perkins. The connection was implicit, undeniable, and utterly damning. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. The TV station's phone lines lit up. The story, posted on their social media, exploded across the region. The comment section was a torrent of outrage and support for David. People shared their own HOA horror stories. It was a digital wildfire, and Carol Jean Perkins was at its center. For the first time, she was not in control. The other two board members, the timid accountant and the retired dentist, saw their names attached to a burgeoning public scandal. Their phones started ringing. They panicked. They were pillars of their church, respected members of their small town. They wanted no part of a public war against a decorated veteran. David, sensing the fracture in their ranks, knew it was time to press the attack. With Earl's help, he spent the next 2 days going door to door, not just on his easement, but throughout the entire Whispering Pines community. Armed with copies of the state law he'd discovered and a petition, they laid out their case. They weren't angry. They were factual. They showed their neighbors the law about financial transparency. They explained the illegal way the board was operating. The news story had cracked the ice. Their quiet, respectful presentation melted the rest. Fear of Carol Jean was replaced by anger at her deception. They got the signatures they needed, more than double the required number, to legally force a special meeting of the membership. David drafted the formal notice himself, again, citing the specific state statutes that made the meeting mandatory. He sent it via certified mail to Carol Jean and the other board members. By law, she had no choice. She had to face the very people she had ruled over for a decade. A date was set. The battle would move from the woods and the airwaves to a face-to-face confrontation. Your story could be next. Comment your HOA horror below and I might cover it. The night of the meeting, the air in the rented community hall was thick and stifling, smelling of stale coffee, damp wool coats, and nervous anticipation. The room was packed, every folding chair filled. David and Earl sat in the front row. It was a strategic choice, a front-line position. Carol Jean and her husband, the commissioner, sat at a long table at the front, attempting to project an aura of authority that was already crumbling. The other two board members sat with them, looking pale and miserable, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. Carol Jean banged a small gavel. The sound was tinny and weak in the tense silence. "This special meeting will come to order," she began, her voice tight. She launched into a prepared speech, a rambling defense filled with accusations and self-pity. She called David a disruptive influence, the news report a malicious one-sided attack, and the concerned homeowners a vocal minority being misled by a troublemaker. She wielded the HOA covenant book like a shield, quoting obscure passages she thought no one would understand. Her arrogance was breathtaking. She wasn't trying to win them over. She was trying to intimidate them into submission one last time. It was a fatal miscalculation. When she finished, a tense silence filled the room. Then David stood up and walked to the microphone. He didn't carry a binder full of rules. He carried a single remote for a projector. "Good evening, everyone," he said, his voice calm and steady, carrying easily through the hall. "I'm not here to talk about my feelings. I'm here to show you facts." One by one, images flashed on the screen behind Carol Jean, trapping her in their glare. First, the 1978 easement document, its legal language clear and undeniable. Then, the Missouri state statute giving every member the right to the HOA's financial records. He clicked again. A spreadsheet appeared. It was a budget he had pieced together from public documents and the few newsletters that had been sent out. It showed over $30,000 paid to her brother-in-law's landscaping company for community beautification, and nearly $50,000 in legal consulting fees paid to the very law firm that had sent him the threatening letter. The crowd murmured. This wasn't about community. It was about enrichment. He showed a timeline of the fines, the sabotage. Then he played the video from his trail cam. The footage was grainy, taken at night, but it was clear enough. A silver SUV, identical to Carol Jean's, pulling up near his well house. A figure getting out. The video wasn't clear enough to press charges, but for everyone in that room, it was a smoking gun. When he finished, Earl Abernathy slowly stood up. He didn't need a microphone. His voice, though quiet, was filled with a moral authority that silenced the room. For 2 years, I wasn't allowed to fly the American flag on my own property, he said simply. A flag my father fought for. A flag I stood for every day for 40 years. I was told it was a nuisance. I ask you, what's the real nuisance here? It was like a dam breaking. A woman in the back stood up, her voice shaking with anger. She fined my daughter $100 for leaving her tricycle on the sidewalk for 20 minutes. AB. Man near the front jumped to his feet. They tried to force me to cut down a 200-year-old oak tree because its leaves were falling in my new neighbor's yard. Story after story tumbled out. A decade of petty tyranny and quiet resentments, finally boiling over into a public rebellion. Carol Jean's face went from flushed red to a pasty, sickly white. She saw her power, her carefully constructed world, dissolving before her very eyes. She banged the gavel frantically. This is not on the agenda. This meeting is out of order. It's adjourned. David stepped back to the microphone. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. This was the moment he had planned for, the final, decisive strike. Actually, Carol Jean, he said, his voice cutting through her panic like a razor, it's not out of order. He let the words hang in the air. According to your own bylaws, Article 12, Section 4, which is reinforced by Missouri State, Statute 355.231, governing the removal of directors in a nonprofit corporation, a motion to remove any and all board members can be called from the floor at any duly announced special meeting, provided a quorum is present. He scanned the packed room. I believe we have a quorum. Therefore, I formally move to remove the entire sitting board of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, Carol Jean Perkins, Bob Finley, and David Chen, effective immediately, for gross negligence and malfeasance of their duties. The room erupted. Second! Earl shouted, his voice ringing with triumph. Carol Jean was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Her husband stood up, sputtering about. Lawsuits. But his voice was drowned out in the chorus of I.S. A vote was hastily called. It wasn't even close. A forest of hands shot up, a wave of populist justice washing over the front table. When the call for nays came, only 3 hands were raised. Carol Jean's, her husband's, and one of their close friends. It was a public humiliation, a complete and total repudiation of her reign. She had been dethroned. In the aftermath, a new interim board was elected on the spot. Earl Abernathy was unanimously voted in as the new president. Their first motion, which passed with a roar of approval, was to rescind all fines levied against David Mills and issue a formal public apology. Their second was to hire a forensic accountant to audit the HOA's books. The State Attorney General's office, prompted by Katie's follow-up report, opened an official investigation into Commissioner Bill Perkins for abuse of power. The county's condemnation of David's septic system was quietly and unceremoniously withdrawn, citing a comprehensive review and clerical error. A month later, the late summer sun warmed the porch of David's cabin. The air was filled with the scent of pine and the rich, dark smell of freshly turned earth from Earl's now unfenced vegetable garden. David stood on a small step ladder, a toolkit in hand. He carefully rehung his grandmother's sea glass wind chimes on the hook by the door. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and the chimes answered with their soft, woody clatter. It was the sound of peace. Earl's old pickup truck rumbled up the drive and parked. In the bed was a brand-new 20-foot aluminum flagpole. Together, the two men spent the afternoon digging a new hole on Earl's property, mixing concrete, and setting the pole until it stood perfectly straight and true, gleaming in the sun. They attached the flag, and as Earl pulled the rope, the stars and stripes rose into the Ozark sky, catching the breeze and unfurling in a glorious wave of red, white, and blue. They stood there for a long time, not saying a word, just watching the flag fly. The gentle tinkling of the wind chimes from David's porch drifted over, mixing with the soft, rhythmic clanking of the rope against the new pole. They were the sounds of a hard-won freedom, of a community restored not by rules and restrictions, but by simple decency. It was never just about a gate. It was never about a woodpile. It was a battle for the simple right to be left alone, to honor the past, and to live in peace on the land your family had loved. They tried to take his home. Instead, he gave his neighbors back their community. If you believe no one is above the law, that power should answer to the people, then hit subscribe. Our fight is just beginning. Like, share, and tag a friend who needs to see that one person, armed with the truth, can still make a stand and win.